Hello, guys and gals, me Mudahar, and one of the questions I get asked is, but Muda, why don't you use a good old Linux phone, ladies and gentlemen? For me, a cell phone, I always hop between like Apple, Android, various different types of Android phones, but I've never really been one to go out and purchase a Linux phone. And I'll explain why. Even though I love using Linux on my main desktop system, I'm a huge Penguin enjoyer. I think it's honestly not all the way there for mobile devices for me to even recommend or endorse in any capacity. So I want to go over some of the options that I showed before just to set the mood here. There are phones like the Pine Phone Pro, which if you look at the spec sheet for this, nothing is actually crazy impressive. I mean, you're talking about purchasing a phone in the big 25 with 4 gigs of memory is kind of, it's a hard sell, brother, is all I'm saying. But there are also other products like, for instance, you've got the good old-fashioned Librem phone. So for companies like Librem, which sells the Liberty phone, which is a security privacy-focused phone, you can actually go to the site over here and see that, whoa, we're looking at a $2,000 phone. Okay, it's kind of tough for me to be billing this shit for you. But again, looking at the actual processor, the memory requirements on it, storage is sitting at 128 gigs, it's kind of a hard sell. And the thing that ultimately is the big deal about this product is if you look at the phone, it's got what appears to be kill switches. So the big draw of this is when you're using your phone, one of the things that honestly matters is like, you want to be able to kill the internet capacity, the radio switches, cellular, yada, 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 because when you can hardware kill these devices on your actual motherboard, that means without a doubt, your phone is not communicating with servers, radio antennas, yada, yada, yada. It used to be back in the day, this is one of the original smartphones that I had, the HTC Surround, which is a Windows phone. I mean, you remember how smartphones used to be back in the day? You used to grip them in one fucking hand. This is the original iPhone, I think 3G, or actually it's just the 3G, not the 3GS. And then of course, this is a current iPhone. You can actually see that, whoa. It's like it's like little bro meets big bro. Kind of crazy shit. But yeah, phones back in the day used to have something that I consider to be a lost art. You can really only find this in the drug dealer drop phone these days, is when you could just pop the back off and just pull out the actual battery like this. You know what I mean? You could pull out the battery and you could ensure that no device, nothing on here was actually getting power because there is no battery to provide it. Now, I would fire up this phone and show it for you just for shits and giggles, but even though this battery doesn't look bloated, I just don't want to risk anything right now, if you catch my drift. But maybe at one point I will dig through the phone that made this channel a reality. Yes, those original creepypastas were filmed using the dog shit microphone on this phone, but you gotta do with what you gotta do, right? When it comes to phones, for me, I just need a phone to make calls, check messages, send emails, yada, yada, yada. Even with some of the most modern smartphones, I'm not usually installing the highest end games and playing them, even though a lot of these phones are quite capable of that. Like if you buy modern phones, thanks to projects like Fex or Winlater, you can actually run PC games like Grand Theft Auto 5 on this device. Is it particularly great? No. Does it stop running after a while? Yeah. Does it heat the device up to an ungodly standard? Yes. In some ways, I would say the battery is literally boiling alive on this poor little smartphone as I'm running a game like GTA 5. But anyways, to go back to Linux phones, right? Linux phones are phones that primarily are sold to people under the sales pitch of privacy. But ultimately, they're not really phones that I would consider to be flagship titles. And I wouldn't really expect any, I wouldn't really even tell somebody that these are flagship phones or phones that, ultimately are worth the price tag they offer. So would I buy the Liberty phone for $2,000? Absolutely not. Would I buy a cheapo Google Pixel device and install GrapheneOS onto it? Absolutely. Because GrapheneOS, to me at least, is proven for privacy and safety. And again, if it pisses off some of those cybersecurity firms out in the world, then you're doing something right. And of course, right now there's some drama with the GrapheneOS guys. I would love to cover it if you guys are interested. Apparently there's somebody who is getting charged for premeditated murder, bitching and complaining about GrapheneOS. not getting rid of the evidence allegedly against him. If you're interested in that, let me know. But anyways, to go back to what's been apparently in the market right now, something that I saw floating around in the news today was the Jolla phone, which apparently also has these physical privacy kill switches. It's apparently a phone that runs actual Linux, not a pseudo Linux, through something they call Sailfish OS. So I decided to go to Jolla's website, and they do sell like community phones for like 300 euros. But to go back to their actual website, one of the things that they have is this Jolla phone that's pre-ordered. And these guys have been around, I guess, since like 2013. And if you look at the actual phone over here, it does match a lot of modern phones that I've seen. I mean, it looks like a fucking smartphone. That's all I can really say. However, there are things like what appear to be physical kill switches. So slide this thing right up, and apparently you kill a lot of those communication vectors. Now, can I remove the battery on this? I actually believe you can. Yeah, they actually say user replaceable battery. We live in a day and age where that's actually a fucking... It's actually a selling point. Now, of course, you look at this device over here and you can see that it's costing around 99 euros for down payment, but the full price is like 549, which at the top of my head, I think is around 880 Canadian dollars. I could be a little bit wrong on that. But yeah, the 549 euros, 880 Canadian dollars, not exactly a cheap phone. But to look at it, right, I wanted to see like what it provides. And they say that it doesn't have any tracking, no calling home, no hidden analytics, and I would hope it doesn't, you know. A lot of Linux distributions don't just talk back home. Now, when it comes to the device, yes, you've got what appears to be a high-performant MediaTek platform for 5G, okay? You've got 12 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, and you can expand with the micro SD. So ultimately, it's a lot better than those other devices, and it's cheaper too. And I guess it runs on something called Linux. In fact, particularly it runs on something they call Sailfish OS, which is their version of Linux. Now, ultimately, I'm not here to talk about how open source some of these things are, but the big selling point is that the Jolla phone apparently also runs Android applications. And you might be like, whoa, okay, that was actually one big deal for me. So I actually did whip out the old, Linux phone. I used it for a fair bit. So this OnePlus actually flashed with Ubuntu Touch, and I did try using it, and it is kind of functional. It's not perfect. It's definitely slow. A lot of problem with these Linux phones is that or Linux distributions on a cell phone is that they're really not optimized for the touchscreen experience, okay? They're really not built for it. They're built primarily for you to be using with a keyboard and mouse, okay? So it's not exactly the fun experience, but it is usable. You can make a call, you can send an email, you can watch a video, but it's not particularly as easy to use as like an Android phone or even an iPhone. And that is where the big sort of sticking point kind of comes to. Now, something that I don't like seeing about this is when they talk about trial versions for what it's supposed to be like a Linux operating system. And I think for them, a big deal is having the ability to run those Android applications. See, one of the big issues with things like these Linux phones for me is that really you want a phone that is compatible with a lot of things. Like, you don't want to spend this kind of money and be given a phone that, you know, you might be regretting upon certain things down the road, right? Like, maybe you want a certain app. Maybe you want certain functionalities that every other phone has, and you should have it without any form of issues. So obviously their phone runs on Linux, but it has the ability to actually install Android applications. So if you're somebody that wants the Android version of YouTube, Spotify, because those may have features that aren't typically or easily accessible on other, you know, open platforms, you may choose to want certain applications, right? Like, it's your phone. It's basically your device. You should be allowed to use it however you want it to. Now, obviously, the way that I assume that this kind of works is through something known as Waydroid. For anybody that doesn't know Waydroid, you can actually run Android applications underneath Linux pretty much natively. Now, I'm not able to show it to you because I have an NVIDIA graphics card, and this is usually for people with integrated GPUs or AMD stuff. That's where it primarily shines. But you can actually kind of install this on pretty much any distribution that kind of supports it. One of those distributions is known as PostmarketOS. Now, for anybody that doesn't know PostmarketOS is actually Linux that you can install onto not just your computer, but your mobile cell phone as well. Now, ultimately, PostmarketOS, I wasn't able to get running just in time for this video. I actually had a bit of an issue with this phone. I think I might have to really go and like deep clean this, get rid of like all the actual various flashes that I've done. But you can install this version of Linux and then install Waydroid and get similar functionalities on this device as well too. So this is by far probably the best running version of Linux on a phone. And that's mostly because you have options to so many better user interfaces, like KDE, for instance, that just blows the fucking water out of many other mobile platforms. And again, it's super easy if you just follow these instructions on how to install things like Waydroid onto things like PostmarketOS. So if you want to have that Android functionality on your Linux phone, you're not completely, landing on just Linux applications on your mobile device, which for most cases don't necessarily work as good as they should. My experience with Linux on cell phone chipsets isn't exactly as great as it is on desktop chipsets, mostly because it's far more infantile in comparison. But that stuff will slowly change. Now, obviously, I'm not a huge fan of these kind of phones, and if I really am completely upfront with you about it, I kind of miss the days when I used to own something like this Kyocera slider phone, because honestly, you could charge this phone like once a week and it would probably stay alive all the way through. Granted, it only made calls and sent text messages, but it was a simpler time, and sometimes that's all I actually really cared about. I find in most cases, modern smartphones are just big old time wasters. Granted, there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do, but ultimately, if we could go back to a world where you didn't need to have certain applications to live your life, then I think that would be a much better timeline. But we don't live in that timeline, so it's kind of impossible to sort of think of a time that unfortunately really can't exist. So when it comes to Linux phones, ladies and gentlemen, let's be completely upfront and real about it. I'm not a huge supporter of this kind of stuff because ultimately I find the market to be kind of infant. I find the market to just not necessarily be there in terms of product. Now that could change down the road, but a lot of these Linux phones, ultimately, their big thing is privacy and stuffing them with things like kill switches, which sounds really cool. And honestly, given the trajectory of where the world is going in terms of data surveillance, it's not a bad third option. It's just a third option that you can't necessarily recommend to somebody out in the market. Now, obviously, when it comes to things like privacy, right, I think the most important thing when it comes to privacy is using something that is supported by a trusted group of individuals. And again, I can't give GrapheneOS enough flowers. Out of all my experience with things like Linux phones and trying to actually use that shit, I've realized that the best experience for me is ultimately if I do really care about my privacy, and this is something that I do when I do fly, when I do go to places like the United States or really any country that has the ability, I guess, at the airports to check my phones. Instead of bringing my main phone with me, I'll usually just bring something like this if I'm going out for like a weekend, and I'll just stick a SIM card into it, and it is loaded with GrapheneOS. And ultimately, if I want to run a few Android applications on this, I easily can. But in terms of security and privacy, I don't think anything is much better than having an Android operating system that is de-Googled and security enhanced, like these operating systems that there are. Again, the Linux experience to me is usually far behind what you'll find on Android and even iOS. And again, with Android, it's not that Android is Linux, it's just that Android was built and primarily geared towards mobile devices anyways. Something that Linux is still generations, in my opinion, behind. Not to say that it can't ever catch up. Obviously it can. I mean, just look at the fucking gaming sphere for the PCs, right? Linux and Windows, you're kind of getting up to neck and neck stuff for certain single player titles. But this is not, the same field, right? This is still far behind everything here. But I think it's still a great third option. I don't want to completely count it out because, hey, we do live in a world where data surveillance and privacy is becoming a big issue. But ultimately, the Linux phones, while they're a cool gimmick, I wouldn't necessarily spend $2,000 on a phone like this. And maybe I'm not even in the market for that because this is probably sold for somebody that ultimately really needs those kill switches and privacy, and $2,000 is what they're paying. They're not paying for the software or the speed of the hardware. They're literally just paying for the kill switch functionality. And maybe that makes sense there. But at that point, for the average Andy out there, in this economy, buying a cheapo Pixel with GrapheneOS is still completely unmatched. And it probably will remain unmatched until some other player jumps into the entire mix. And now, even when it comes to things like iPhones, for instance, a lot of these devices, and look, I made a video literally like a day ago where I talked about how ads are able to hack your phones. And the thing is, ultimately, what's more important than like Linux being on your phone is how much the companies are actually supporting the devices they use. Look, you can talk a lot of shit about companies like Apple, but privacy and security is like literally one of their big selling points these days. Is it to say that Apple isn't tracking you or using your information? I can't confirm that one way or another. But the thing about it is that when I was really talking to a few people in the security space, it's like buying like an Android phone off the market is kind of a spooky deal with the devil, because usually you're involving yourself with companies like Google, which love, in my opinion, grabbing your user information. In fact, it's more incentivized for them. So unless, there's a few tiers to this, right? If you want total privacy, I think maybe a $2,000 phone with the ability to remove the batteries and add kill switches might be probably the most private thing out there in the market, but it's not economically feasible, and it's just not something that's fit to be a daily driver because the operating system underneath it doesn't necessarily fly well for mobile shit. But if you're looking at probably one of the most private offerings, I think iPhones out of the box probably have more privacy focus to them. I mean, anything that pisses off companies like Facebook when it comes to tracking your device, I love when companies like Facebook just beg to track your information and you can just tell them no, even though they'll probably get the information through another identifier on your device or something or whatever. But I think that kind of stuff is generally pretty cool. I think having phones where, again, they're very encrypted to start off with, you have the ability to leave your cloud stuff completely. A lot of this stuff is easily done through an iPhone. I think that's pretty cool stuff right there. But ultimately, the best mainstream option for most people is probably buying a cheap Google Pixel. You can even buy some of the newest ones now, flash GrapheneOS to them, and probably get the most privacy-focused security experience that you can, all without breaking the bank and utilizing software that isn't really mature enough. So yeah, Linux phones, in my opinion, kind of gimmicky. Honestly, if I'm going to be completely real with you, I think that for every single one of these products that come out, there's definitely like 10 negatives to the one positive that they bill. But yeah, it's one of the reasons why I personally don't use Linux phones, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I want a phone. I want a phone that is able to function normally. I want a phone that has the ability to do normal shit. But if I really do care about privacy and security, going to GrapheneOS is pretty much where we're at, and anything more than that, almost in many cases, seems a bit too performative. But given the trajectory of the world right now, and given some of the decisions at Google, what they're doing with Android, remember, Android is open source, much like the Linux kernel itself, much like Linux. For as long as Android will exist, as long as the Android open source project exists, which is how it was founded, companies or organizations like Graphene will always take Android and de-Google them and basically remove as much of the filth from them for the average person. That's the beauty of open source, okay? It doesn't matter what Google wants. You can decouple yourself entirely from Google. But having a third option like Linux is pretty cool. Hopefully it matures. But as of right now, there's a reason I don't use a Linux phone, okay? It's just too much of a hassle for really anything. Anyways, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it, I am out.